This show is 100% independent, non-corporatized activist news, and we'd like to keep doing it. So to become a patron, visit patreon.com/actout to donate. This week on Act Out, Medicare turns 52 years old this year, and as organizers gear up for their 52 events for Medicare's 52nd, we take another look at why Medicare for All matters and how you can join the fight. Next up, Cultures of Resistance director Iara Lee wasn't content to just document suffering, she wanted to do something about it. In this special interview, she outlines her work as an activist, artist, and filmmaker, how art is a catalyst for change, and what she's learned on the front lines of hundreds of movements for change. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Happy birthday, Medicare! Or not a very happy birthday, Medicare. On Sunday, Medicare will turn 52 years old, and I'll be damned if this isn't the most awkward birthday it's had. As Congress laments its continuing failed efforts to kill poor people, Medicare stands as the elephant-in-the-room solution that big pharma and insurance companies eagerly try to slaughter, cover up, or paint as anything but what it really is, which is the solution to our clusterfuck for-profit healthcare system. If you saw last week's episode, you'll recall our brief comparison of the ACA to the AHCA, the millions under both plans that would either remain uninsured or find themselves newly uninsured, while everyone, regardless of which plan we're under, gets to enjoy the most expensive access to pharmaceuticals and healthcare. And while we're selling cars, houses, heirlooms, and loved ones in order to pay for routine operations, comparable countries are living longer lives without having to pay for it. Indeed, the US has the lowest life expectancy compared to countries with similarly large GDP and high average income. Although, speaking of income, we are leading the pack in income inequality, so look on the bright side. If you are one of the millions of Americans living in poverty, you can rest assured that you won't be living in poverty as long as you could be if we had a Medicare for All system. Which, incidentally, that would also mean that the, say, roughly 25 million adults who skip taking medication because they can't afford it would then take that medication, meaning that they'd probably live longer, assuming that the medication was prescribed correctly and not one of the many cases of misprescribed or overprescribed medications. Indeed, the average American fills 12 prescriptions every year, and in the last 2 decades, our spending on prescription meds has increased by $200 billion. That's a pretty sweet payday for big pharma and their friendly physician with an itchy prescription finger. Meanwhile, Americans are in many cases getting sicker the more drugs that we take. The combination of incentives to prescribe plus direct consumer advertising suggesting that you just have to ask your doctor about this new pill means that many Americans are taking conflicting medications, often ones that they don't even need. Last year, the CDC released a report showing that at least 30% of all antibiotics prescribed in the US are unnecessary. And according to a report at Columbia University and the New York State Psychiatric Institute, more than half of the youth prescribed anti-psychotic medications were given these prescriptions without a diagnosis of a mental disorder. And less than 25% of prescribed youth had any therapy services. In other words, if Danny's a bit hyperactive, pump him full of meds till he doesn't know which end is up, and whatever you do, don't let him talk it out. Because I believe the children are our future. And still in other news, 99% of doctors who hand out prescriptions for narcotic painkillers exceed the federally recommended 3-day dosage limit. And Americans consume 80% of the global opioid supply, 300 million pain prescriptions in 2015, a $24 billion industry just for pain. I wonder why the US Army is protecting poppy fields in Afghanistan, where 90% of the world's opium comes from. I'm sure that's unrelated. Now, are we really in that much pain? Or are our kids really that fucking ADHD, bipolar, ADD, or otherwise psychotic? No, of course not. I mean, we may very well become that psychotic if we keep pumping ourselves full of Mother's Little Helper and friends, but again, the real reason that we not only pay more but also take more pills is money. For Big Pharma and the insurance companies that run our for-profit sick care system. In a more morbid and Orwellian sense, it's also a shit ton easier to keep us drugged up and dumbed down rather than dealing with an alert, healthy populace wise to the workings of a plutocratic, oligarchic, capitalist crown. So it's profit overall, with zombie plebes as a complementary side effect. The incentives to over-medicate patients is but a piece of the for-profit sick care pie. Expensive procedures are another piece. For example, 95% of lower back pain could be solved by sending people to physical therapy. But physical therapy doesn't pay as much as, an MRI or even orthopedic surgery. So we spend $19 billion a year on unfucking medical errors that could have easily been avoided had we gone with the correct treatment rather than the more expensive one. And too good to be true though it may seem, Medicare for All would solve these problems. You could get the physical therapy, the mental therapy, because doctors won't get paid more to shove you into an MRI machine or get bonuses for prescribing anti-psychotic meds. When you use the bargaining power of Medicare to negotiate fair drug prices, something the ACA barred in order to get insurance companies to sign on, we're no longer the cash cow meal tickets for Big Pharma. When everyone is covered, you don't need to spend $200 billion a year on admin costs. Yes, $200 billion a year. Little side note here, last Thursday the Congressional Budget Office released a report saying that the newest new shitty version of the AHCA would reduce the deficit by $420 billion in the 2017 to 2026 period. In order to do so, it would throw another 22 million people under the bus without health coverage, slash Medicaid by $756 billion by 2026, partially by phasing out Medicaid expansion. So let's see. That means that over the course of 9 years, you'd save $420 billion by killing people, or perhaps even worse, letting them writhe under the pointed spear of the almighty dollar, when you could just give everyone health care and in those same 9 years save $1,800 billion. But I agree, it's way more fun to watch people suffer. The bottom line is, when your bottom line is health, not wealth for big pharma and insurance companies, you not only save people, you as a country, as a people, save money. So as we stare down Medicare's 52nd birthday, as members of Congress sharpen their corporately sponsored machetes and turn to that elephant in the room, we gotta do more than just bust out the popcorn and watch. As I mentioned in last week's show, millions already depend on Medicare for their health care, and millions more could and should. Medicare doesn't need to be cut, it needs to grow. Even if you only care about the monetary gains, imagine what we could do with the billions not spent on unfucking medical injuries and pointless admin costs. Imagine what people would do with the extra money they didn't have to spend on a simple procedure or the simple medication that they require. But more importantly, imagine what people would do if they were healthier. If they weren't unnecessarily drugged up or thrown into surgery, if kids weren't pumped full of anti-psychotic meds and told to go sit in a corner by themselves. If people weren't addicted to pain meds or taking 14 different pills when one pill or even some weed would suffice. And while you're imagining, head over to Health Over Profit's Medicare Birthday Action page via the bit link below. There you'll find tools and ideas for Medicare events that highlight the importance of Medicare for All, including speak-outs, house parties, and rallies outside of congressional members' offices. You'll also find tools to bolster those actions or inspire your own. Now, moving on. For those of you familiar with the show, you'll know that creativity and overtly political art are cornerstones of the show. The idea that art is a snapshot of our time, our place, our socio-political paradigms. The idea that all art is in fact political, some is just a passive support system for the status quo, while some other art is unapologetically critical of the status quo, dissenting and resisting, weaving alternatives and new ideas through countless mediums. One such example of the latter is Iara Lee's Cultures of Resistance. What started as a post 9/11 documentary is now a multi-film network and outreach site that not only highlights the work of creative resistance around the world, but that actively works to support it through grants and collaborative works. A while back, we sat down with Iara to discuss her work, the importance of art being more than just art for art's sake, and even more so, the importance of not using others' pain for film festival accolades, but to create art and to use art for real change. Take a look.
I come from the arts and culture world, but I realized we need to use arts and culture for something beyond arts and culture. And that's why I started making films and using it for political activists. But it's all about creative resistance. It's still very connected to arts and culture. And then I also realized that making films or just denouncing or just bringing awareness was also not enough. So then I started this foundation where we actually try to support very hands-on some of the people that we cover or some of the issues we cover in our films. So it just makes it more complete. The whole epiphany happened in 2000 when I was in Pakistan, in the Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan, trying to make a film about the woman under the Taliban. And they started throwing stones at us. And I was just like, wow, I'm trying to do something positive to bring awareness about what's going on. And then they started yelling, saying, every day we have photographers, journalists, and nothing changes. We are fed up of media. And that's when I realized that maybe it was important to not just document, but try to, extend something humanitarian. Also because we filmmakers, a lot of times, we capture all these horrible stories, and then we go around showing at film festivals, getting awards, but we leave people as we found them. So for me, it's very important to have this segment that follows up on what we start with the media.
Yeah, and it was also something that I noticed in the first film. There was a comment by one of the people that you interviewed that resistance not as opposition but as building something. So you mentioned that in terms of the role of actually building up public works or schools, but talk about the role of art in creating that alternative.
I think, a lot of times political analysts, they write very intricate and deep analysis, but in order to touch people's heart, I think it's sometimes a powerful song or an amazing photo or even a film can really do the job much better. So I really think arts and culture have this it's a very powerful tool of engagement to push people to action. I mean, I just came, for example, from Burkina Faso, where I documented creative resistance. And a lot of times when you ask people why they were part of the insurrection that removed this president that was glued to power for 27 years, and a lot of times they may not even say it's because I went and I saw this theater play or I saw this dance, but these are actually things that become catalysts. And a lot of times people become part of a movement because they are inspired by the arts. So I think it's a very effective path.
And sort of in that same vein, but shifting slightly, you've interacted with so many people and communities struggling for just basic rights around the world. Do you feel that one of the things that is holding back really effective movements here in the States is that there isn't that sense of extreme urgency? Like, we're not dealing with widespread famine, for instance, mass murder via armed militias. So do you think that might be something that's stopping people from actually going out and engaging on an activist daily basis? Or how do you think that we might be able to engage before we see more of our rights curtailed?
I don't know, because in a way in Europe, in America, we have a very different level of problem. It's this kind of very disguised with elegance, because I always say, yeah, people are always pointing fingers at the dictators in Africa and Latin America, but the biggest dictators and the biggest terrorists are the state terrorists of very wealthy countries. And I just don't know. I think people in the US should be aware of that, because, okay, when you see famine, when you see refugees, it's something very visually right there. But these invisible terrorists that state governments practice, like US bombing, through remote control drones in Pakistan and Afghanistan, somewhere in the desert of Nevada, just playing like a video game and killing people so far away. it's so technological, it's so intangible that people cannot relate. But I think, we filmmakers, I mean, obviously we can only do so much. I kind of focus in issues related to the Middle East and Africa, but we need more filmmakers in the first world countries to show those kind of very, elegant and high profile terrorists, and then mobilize people to work, because these are actually the biggest problems. Even, I don't want to compare, but it's the ripple effect is so much more huge compared to just, a little famine here or something there, because the US, whatever the US does, it trickles down the whole world. So we really need a lot of engagement in first world countries.
So with that, something that I also noticed in the work that you do is this is the role of nationalism. For example, in that first film, there were these Rwandan musicians that were, wearing colors of the Rwandan flag, and there was this call to build pride in their country. And I'm curious how you've seen that in third world countries be used as a tool to really gain some sort of movements for human rights, compared to how we see nationalism play out in first world countries. It actually becomes sort of a way to argue for oppression as opposed to arguing for human rights.
I don't know, this film I made in Burkina Faso, throughout the whole film, people say, we want to be proud to be African, we want to be proud to be Burkinabe. And, and this, it's represented through their attachment to the way they eat and the where they wear their clothes, the way they practice their African religions, even if they have, Christianity or Islam as part of their lives as well. So I think in that sense, it's like being proud of their indigenous culture instead of calling it nationalism, And there's a lot of tolerance within this kind of like being proud of their culture and being African, or being Syrian or being Lebanese. And so it's different. Like we see nationalism like in some of the European countries as kind of not wanting the diversity, and which is different with what we see in African countries or other parts of the world.
I'm also curious, going back to the first point that you made about having stones thrown at you for just being another media person. Do you recognize any sort of pushback against an outsider coming in to try and build a school, for instance, or is that a completely different interaction?
I always try to work with grassroots organizations in those countries, because we, the white people or the Western people, always think we have a lot to teach, but actually we have a lot to learn. And even sometimes we have good intention, but it's not effective. So it's very important to always work with people on the ground. And we do that systematically. And so it doesn't come across as someone, coming from America or Europe trying to impose ideas, because they know better what they need. And we are just kind of a support system. And I think that's very important, to be humble and understand that actually we have more to learn than to teach.
And in terms of a support system, or even just somebody trying to document, you've documented nonviolent activism and also violent activism. Talk about the difference there, and talk about your feelings. You've come out and said that you don't personally support violent tactics, but talk about what you've seen, and could violent tactics be useful? Have they been useful? Talk about your experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us to say nonviolence, but when people are massacred, and even like when I was in Nigeria with the militants, they were saying, for so long we had these heroes with candles and white flags, and the government and the multinational oil corporations, they wouldn't pay any attention. But when we came with the Kalashnikovs, people paid attention. So there is something to be said, and it's a discussion that, again, I don't think we can have final answers. I think sometimes if you're in the middle of the jungle and people just come and, commit all these atrocities, governmental atrocities, it's hard to say stay nonviolent, but I think ultimately if we can promote change, which is obviously slower but more real, through creative resistance, I think is more effective and more long term. because, it is always that situation that war cannot stop war, and this whole thing, let's bomb this person or this government because they're bombing others, and it just goes on and on. It's where are we going to end up?
And also with that, the creativity isn't just, about art. It's about the creativity and thinking about how to resist. What are some of the best or most profound tactics that you've seen that really speak to this idea of creative activism?
Well, I think when I went to Vietnam and I saw the museum during the Vietnam War, all the tactics they had to be very smart and creative in order to fight this mighty power that was the US, and they did. So that was very much like, wow. I mean, even in filmmaking, sometimes you see very low budget films that are so much more successful in effect than huge budget films. So it's not just about power. It's not just about money. It's not just about these things that you always associate to effective way of success. So it's about being creative and find the little possibilities that are not so obvious, and be strategic within the constraints of not having a lot of power or technology or wealth. But it's possible. We've seen it. We've seen many times in history, and I think that's very inspiring.
And also, I mean, you touched upon this a little bit, with the idea of making films and, going and getting the accolades for the films, and then people are still stuck in the same situation. But also there seems to be, Naomi Klein's newest documentary, it opens up with her saying that I couldn't just take one more picture of a dying polar bear. It wasn't getting through to people because obviously we're still really reeling from the effects of climate change and not being able to make definitive action to fight it. So as a filmmaker, but also as somebody who works on the ground in these communities, has there been a sort of like desensitization to these images? And then how do you go about trying to foment a reaction from the viewers if we have indeed become desensitized to these images of suffering?
Yeah, this is very much I think it became an anesthesia. People just don't feel it, and it's just amazing. You watch TV, here's a commercial toothpaste, and then an intercut with, Syrian refugees, and then go back to like the latest Nike shoes, and everything gets mumbo jumbo, and people just don't care. And they've seen so much violence on newspapers and TV that they become completely desensitized. And that's why I think, again, when I make films, instead of just showing the ugly side, I try to conquer people's heart through the beauty of, a culture. For example, Western Sahara, nobody has ever even heard. They don't even know it's a country, even less that it has been occupied by Morocco for over 40 years. And instead of just showing Moroccans, doing all these human rights infringements, I like to show the Western Sahara beautiful colors and the food and their language and their traditions. And that's one of the reasons we should support their self-determination, because they have their own culture. And I think a lot of times showing the positive thing is more effective than just showing the ugly and the negative that people are just completely desensitized.
Since you've been to all of these different places and seen all these cultures of resistance, literally, and as someone looking at your body of work, there seems to be definite red threads between these conflicts, whether they're taking place in South America or Africa or what have you. But then there's also this question, there's this back and forth with activists like, oh, well, we live in a global world versus working locally, and yet we are the 99%. We are the vast majority of people who want peace, who want income equality and healthcare and food and shelter. Is there a way, or would it be a good idea for us to try to link up with our efforts, or should we really focus on our local fights and try to win these battles at home?
I think everything counts, like small gestures, big gestures, and big movements, small movements. And I think that's the beauty, everything is important. Sometimes people say, oh, Yara, you're all over the place. And some people, sometimes they accuse me. It's not about the children, it's about the women's rights. And then the ecologists come and say, no, it's about conservation. It's not about indigenous rights. And I always tell people it's about everything. It's about all of us working in cohesion and supporting each other instead of just fighting, there's this whole issue about fighting for funding. So everybody's just so cutthroat. Sometimes I call the peace industry, because people in the peace industry seem to be more warmongers than warmongers. But I think if we had more solidarity, more global solidarity to address local issues and global issues, and if we could all work together and respect that everything is part of the puzzle, and work and in cohesion together, not just like, oh, I'm more important than you because I'm doing indigenous rights. No, I'm more important because I'm doing conservation. No, it's about everything.
For more on Iara Lee and her tremendous work with Cultures of Resistance, check out culturesofresistance.org. And finally today, if I may be so bold, I'd like to recommend a rather self-serving segment of Get Cozy. For those of you who watch the show frequently, you'll know that it's been a little while since I did any spoken word on the show, and that's because I've been doing a lot of spoken word off the show, not least of all finalizing the release of my first book, a selection of radical verse and visuals called Paradigm Lost. The book includes spoken word pieces that first aired on this show, plus powerful artwork by 15 badass artists from around the world, a few who have also been on this show. You can find more information about the book on my website, artkillingapathy.com. Performances or events at bookstores will be listed on the performance page as they are added. And if you'd like to suggest a bookstore or a venue, you can contact me there as well. And with that, we will wrap this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for what I